Good evening. My name is Jamie Besant. I'm the Visitor Engagement Coordinator at Soldiers Memorial Military Museum. Welcome to the PTSD panel discussion hosted by Kelly Bernal, Chris Hancock, and Yasmin Uveris. Unfortunately, it looks like Yasmin wasn't able to join us tonight, so it may have been downgraded from a panel discussion to a two-person discussion. But no worries. So first of all, I want to thank our members for their support, which allows us to put on programs like this. If you're interested in becoming a member of the Missouri Historical Society, I'll be putting, once we get the program underway, I'll put a link in the chat that you can click. I need to mention a few things about how the webinar is going to work before we get started. So it's going to run probably 20 or 30 minutes of well, probably 20 minutes of discussion followed by Q&A. So some of those questions will come from me that we've prepared ahead of time, and then we'll also be taking audience questions if you have any. If you have questions, they can be submitted through the Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please don't use the chat function. I won't be able to see it. I'll be checking the Q&A box for the questions. Today's presentation is being recorded, so if you want to see it again or show it to anyone else, it'll be uploaded to Missouri Historical Society's YouTube channel just a few days from now. Finally, we really value your feedback. When you close out the webinar, a survey should automatically open in your browser. If you'd be willing to take a couple minutes to fill that out for us, that would be really useful. And closed captioning is now automatically available on Zoom. You should be able to find that in that same bottom toolbar where you can find the Q&A box. So with all that being said, I'm going to kick it to Kelly Bernal, who's going to give us kind of a general introduction to our topic tonight, which is PTSD.
Hi there, bear with me. I have a head cold. My name is Kelly Bernal. I am a mental health provider within the community, and I'm a military veteran from the U.S. Army, and I have worked and supported military veterans, and I also do some individual practice within the community. So I've worked with a broad spectrum of mental health. How the PTSD applies with this situation is I've worked with members in the community who are veterans. I've worked with civilians that have had traumatic experiences that led to PTSD, and then it's actually had an effect on my own life. Did you want me to do the history now, or wait till Chris is ready to introduce himself?
Yeah, sure. Why don't we get Chris's introduction?
Good evening. My name is Chris Hancock. I'm a recent retiree from the United States Army. Retired a year ago. I started working in the mental health community approximately 6 years ago. And as far as PTS goes, our facility is pretty much all about the treating PTSD of the soldiers and their families. So,
got it. Thank you. Oh, yeah, Kelly, if you could give us just kind of a general intro. I think a lot of people have heard of PTSD, but might not have a lot of detailed information. I know I didn't. So if you'd be willing to give us kind of a general background, that would be really useful.
PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, and it covers a wide variety of psychological, physical, and behavioral responses to traumatic incidences or environments. It can come on anywhere from immediately, but usually within the first month of experiencing some kind of a traumatic event. And it can be a one-time event, or in the case of firefighters, first responders, and policemen, a lot of times there can be an accumulative effect that leads to PTSD as well. The recorded incidences when people started studying PTSD, as long as there have been cavemen, going out to hunt for food, and sometimes dinner might eat them instead of them eating dinner. we understand and know that trauma has been a part of the human existence. But for it to be studied, first time it was shown in the diagnostic and statistics manuals was about 1980. But if you go back and do the research on several of the websites that are available for PTSD, that it talks about the documentation of, in the Civil War, it was called soldier's disease, or acute mania. In situations after Civil War in the United States, in World War I, it was called shell shock. But they have diaries that they went back into King and people that were educated who would talk about the illnesses that came about after battle. And they've documented histories with PTSD going back into earlier to the 1400s, where there was an acute mania or some type of a reaction that they now understand as PTSD. So it's been around as long as we have. Studying it and treating it has made great strides in the last 100 years or so. Some of the symptoms of PTSD, and generally a lot of times, like with a car wreck or a train accident or something, we usually respond to the physical or the immediate symptoms. So we might not even recognize that there is a traumatic response. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times they notice the onset after the physical has started to resolve itself, and it will manifest as, well, the stereotype you see in the movies is the veterans doing something and there'll be flashbacks and they might scream incoming and then duck and hit the ground, or it's a hyper alertness, being aware of your environment. Chris, if you feel like I'm missing anything here, feel free to chime in, because I personally have not experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, but my understanding is in a diagnosed situation. My father came back from the Korean War with several related illnesses that now we know to be PTSD. But a lot of the responses, there's a physical, behavior, like I said, behavioral, physical, and mental health issues, high increased anxiety, nightmares, insomnia, just to name a few.
Did you have anything to add to that, Chris?
No, I think she covered it rather well.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thanks for the overview, Kelly, because there's definitely stuff in there that was new information for me. I have to imagine a lot of members of our audience might not have had all that information as well. So the first question that I had for both of you was, what influenced your decision to work with people with PTSD? Why don't we start with Chris, if that's okay?
Fantastic.
Okay. I think my greatest factor of influencing my pursuit of getting into the field to treat PTSD was having observed it as a police officer. I recently retired as a police officer also after 36 years, and seen a lot of horrific instances. And then as a combat soldier, I've done 4 tours in Afghanistan, and it's just, there was just something missing. I mean, I knew I was having issues myself, and I am diagnosed with such. And it might not feel like it, but once you start experiencing some of the symptoms and everything, it's the best thing to do is just talk about it. Go get help. It's very refreshing to find, whenever you're talking about your concerns, that you're actually not that abnormal in your experiences. And it does normalize it by hearing and seeing everyone else's responses. And you're not crazy. You're not crazy. It's just a real healthy pursuit to get that. And then going fast forward to going to Iraq, that's where my first tour is where we really earned our pay and saw the issues with myself, my teammates, and some of the Iraqis too. So, and I just knew there had to be something to address this, and who better to do it than someone who's cut from the same cloth.
Right.
So,
So you were able to get treatment before you decided that that was something that you wanted to help provide for other people.
no, I had actually experienced some things as a police officer, and I started my educational pursuit then. And then after I went to Iraq, it was a long road because military interruptions and everything. But I was target was acquired at that point. I knew where I needed to be.
Gotcha. Thank you. What about you, Kelly?
The question was, what is something, repeat the question for me, please.
What influenced your decision to get into working with people with PTSD?
Oh, wow. When I started counseling, I wasn't aware trauma was as broad spread as it is. And Kaiser Permanente Insurance Company was running a weight loss program in 1998. And they inadvertently stumbled on and developed a study called the ACEs study, which is, I forgot what ACEs stands for. Basically, they found that the average American, with this ACEs study, I'm trying to make it a short, they inadvertently asked a few questions that led to why some people lost tremendous amounts of weight and others didn't in this program. And they found out that a significant, extraordinary number of Americans suffered with trauma in ways that they had not even considered. The numbers that I was looking at a while ago show that 6 out of 10 adult males will experience at least one traumatic event in their life, and that 5 out of every 10 females in the United States experience trauma. And they developed a questionnaire which has 9 basic questions in it addressing the trauma, and they added that questionnaire to hospital ERs, doctors' offices, urgent care clinics, different variety of different places, just asking those questions. And they had an exorbitant, it was unbelievable, because when the guy took it to the conference to present how much trauma he had found and how it relates to what we go through, heart trouble, all the physical effects, heart trouble, weight gain, the physical, the sexual abuse that result in these mental and physical health problems later in life was just off the charts. And after they repeated it and studied it in larger numbers, they found that if you have 4 or more of these numbers on this questionnaire as a positive, that the higher the trauma and the effect of it on your life. So after I saw that, you'll see a lot of things nowadays when you see mental health things or people in doctor's office, they'll talk about trauma-informed care.
Mm-hmm.
And because these numbers were so high just for the average person, let alone being in the military, and we all understand that any kind of combat situation is going to cause a traumatic opportunity. But these were kids growing up in foster care. These are adults living their regular everyday life. And the military also looks a lot at resilience. So to make a long story short, I stumbled onto it accidentally working with the military veterans and a couple of other people who'd lived through a traumatic tornado or something in the environment or a car wreck. And then to find out that PTSD and the trauma is so widespread that there's no way you could work in the mental health field and not encounter someone who's had some.
I think, by the way, that ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. I could be off on that, though.
No, that's it.
And yeah, that's definitely something. It's not something I know a lot about, but I feel like something I've been hearing more lately is that our physical health and our mental health is a lot more connected than maybe we assumed before. That things aren't quite as discrete as, oh, this is a problem with your body or this is a problem with your mind or whatever. And that, yeah, that when we have these experiences, that winds up affecting your blood pressure and all kinds of other stuff. Well, thank you, Kelly. So I guess the follow-up to that question would be, how has your work, particularly with PTSD, impacted your life? How has it changed you?
How has it changed me? Um,
Oh,
well,
sorry, I think your mic might be covered, Kelly. Thanks.
is that better?
Yes.
Didn't know, but I did. Okay, it's how it affected me because okay, I don't know how many people watch Star Trek, but you said some of our clients, some of the people watching the show might be um, in the same category age-wise as me, maybe. Um, the actor Patrick Stewart's father was alcoholic and very violent towards his mother and some other issues. And one of the things he said that he grew up kind of hating his father. And then after he found out that his father had PTSD, it made it a lot easier for him to come from a place of forgiveness and healing. And that I think we find that a lot of these things they're written off as moral failures. Turns out it's people trying to cope with the untreated depression and or symptoms that people have from PTSD. So that's the treatment working with people. My father was also most likely had PTSD. It's too late. He's dead now to actually diagnose. But looking at his history and what I know about him, that's very similar to the situation that Patrick Stewart described. And where I'm going with it is the fact that then my exposure to the ACEs program and then just encountering it every day in a daily situation when I'm doing individual practice or working with the clients that I do at the mental hospital where I'm currently employed, um, it's just pervasive, and it helps me have a more what we call global understanding of that we're all mind, body, spirit, or mind body connection. And if you can get a person unstuck from that place that PTSD puts them, then it helps them heal all over. So it's informed my care and treatment when I'm working with someone to be a better clinician as well as have a better understanding of some of the things that they go through.
Can I ask, did your dad ever talk about any of the stressful or traumatic things that he experienced during the war? It was just kind of observing his behavior later. Yeah.
I have a cousin who's about 11 years older than me that was in Vietnam. And my experience with veterans is that they generally only really open up on the really deep stuff to other people who have been there or who understand. It's kind of like Chris said a while ago, somebody of the that has an understanding in a way that a civilian might not.
Right. Well, I'll ask you the same thing, Chris. How has this work changed you, or has it made some kind of an impact on your life?
Say again.
Has your work with clients with PTSD, has it made any kind of a change in your life or an impact on your life?
I think it has changed me. Again, being diagnosed with PTSD myself, I'm able to relate to my clients a lot better. What's understood doesn't need to be explained. We've got our own siblings out there. We've got our big brothers meaning Vietnam and Korean War vets. And they have taken us younger veterans underneath their wings and said, never again will this happen. And they're making good on that promise. As far as how it's assisted me, when I engage veterans, it's a learning experience for myself. So both of us are benefiting, and it's just at different levels. And it's very rewarding to get someone who's been suppressing a traumatic memory or refuse to talk about it after 40, 50 years, and have them come forward with it. And I always say, thank you for sharing that. And there's more times than not a lot of tears. And that in itself that's the first step in hitting that release valve. There's three things that I think we look for and we rely on and measure a provider by, and that's trust, safety, and non-judgment. If you can employ all three of those, you're in a good position to build that clinical relationship.
You mentioned older veterans saying never again. That's when you say that, that's talking about kind of unrecognized and untreated PTSD. Is that what you meant by that?
Yes, it is. They have told me, like, whenever I first started working in the field, when I was conducting a group, and they asked me, they said, Chris, when are you going to bring your guys in here? I said, what do you mean? I said, tell them don't mess their lives up the way that we did, waiting 40, 50 years, wasting our marriages, destroying relationships with our children and our jobs and our health. And said, we received the cold shoulder, all the atrocities that was thrown at them, not being acknowledged, rotten fruit, other items thrown at them, and told to take their uniforms off. Don't go out in society with your uniforms. Don't even tell people you were in Vietnam. And that created a lot of guilt with them. And now that, in light of Desert Storm and everything forward of that, they're saying, we're not going to allow you guys to be treated like us.
Got you. You also mentioned that they're making good on that promise. Can you speak at all to what kind of work they're doing?
They like staying in the shadows. They don't want the publicity or anything like that, but what they are doing is the mentoring. There's a lot of mentoring going on by the older veterans. It's basically the big brother or the father position. I mean, which I think was evident whenever they told me, get my guys in there. Mm-hmm. And they will check in on younger veterans and everything. Yeah.
That's great. That's great to hear. Because like you said, that I see a lot of humility in a lot of the veterans that I interact with at work, and kind of everybody wants to say, oh well, I never did anything, or I'm not a hero, and it seems like that kind of, from the sound of it, that extends and later into life, and even though they're doing good work supporting their fellow service members, it's kind of still that discomfort with the recognition. That's really interesting. My next question for both of you is what's a common misconception about PTSD? Because it's definitely something most people have heard of, but it's, like I mentioned, it's maybe not something everybody knows a lot about. So do you ever hear people say things about PTSD where you're like, oh, that's not that's not quite right?
I'll take the lead on this one. A lot of times you'll hear a preconceived notion. If you hear of something that's happened, first thing they want to identify is, oh, it was a combat veteran. It's media distortion trying to, fit their own agenda. And that is one of the most things. And you know, veterans and combat veterans, we are not crazy. We're not demonic or anything like that. I think everyone needs to realize that you have isolated cases where people might go off, but statistically speaking, I think it's probably far less than mainstream America.
One of the misconceptions that I see is that stereotype of the guy running around with the long hair and the military jacket waiting to explode over the least little thing. And the other misconception is that with PTSD, if you ask for help, that's weakness. And so those are both stereotypes that are as far from, you know, like Chris said, there might be that one that's done it that makes the news, but that's by and far the least number of them out there. I mean, military makes up what, about 11% of the population, Chris?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's you know, but besides the misconception in the general public, it seems like a danger there then is that if the idea of someone with PTSD is someone who's acting out in aggressive ways or something like that, then you know, people who might benefit from treatment might not even recognize that that what they're experiencing is trauma related or anything like that. That feels like a good segue into, I wanted to ask about the role of stigma in seeking treatment or just in living with trauma. Is that something that you've encountered with your clients? Have people spoken about that kind of stigma at all?
We'll let Chris lead on that one.
To address the stigma, there is still a lot of prejudice out there with employers. They don't want, with some employers, they don't want anyone who's been combat. He's going to do, you know, the same. You know, they're just being discriminated against. In the private sector, I really don't know of any instances. So.
I think that with, in regard to stigma, we're still in a stage, it's better, but where mental illness still has a stigma. And it's something that's wrong with someone, they're broke, they're, you know, crazy. It's still hard or difficult for some people to come forward to seek help with mental health. And I think PTSD is another scoop on top of that. Because like I said, the stigma within the service that I encountered was even when I was doing support counseling with the Military and Family Life Program, that a lot of times the service members didn't want to go to a counselor on base because then it would become part of their record. And they'd have that stigma that they're crazy or that they're weak or that, you know, if something did happen later on, it would affect their career negatively. So there's the overall mental health stigma or having to seek help with mental health, and then the service member on top of that. Because like I said, a lot of times perceived as weakness.
Right. So you mentioned mental illness generally. Do you feel like PTSD in particular, like there's any kind of a difference between the way that we see mental illness in general and the way that we see PTSD in particular?
I think that there's a perception that like depression or anxiety are acceptable mental illnesses now, as long as they're not super bad. But PTSD and trauma still have more stigma around them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I have a client currently right now who's a mid-30s, has 3 children at home, and she has been diagnosed as with a significant mental illness, but she's re-diagnosed herself and done the research, being a college graduate with something that she can it's more palatable to her. She can, it's okay to be this, but not
Right.
schizophrenic.
Right. That's really interesting. My next question is pretty closely related to a previous question. So if you don't have a new answer, that's totally understandable. But it's what's something that you wish that more people knew about PTSD, or about people living with PTSD?
Weird. Something that I wish that they knew more about PTSD is that it is
Sorry, Kelly, the mic.
better.
Better.
Now? I'm just going to keep my hand from over there. With PTSD and just mental, with that many, 50% of the female population suffering trauma, 60% of the male population in the United States suffering trauma, at least one traumatic event in their lifetime, that those numbers are pretty high. So if we could move PTSD from being this awful thing that's out there somewhere, it happens to other people, and realize that growing up in the United States, well, growing up anywhere, I mean, there's other places where the healthcare isn't as good as it is here. And there's countries that I've been in where the poor people here are way better off than poor people in another country. So without going down that road, but if we could realize that and incorporate the fact that mental illness and mental health are maybe opposite sides of the same coin, and it not be stigmatized at all. So with PTSD being part of that, because like I said, 50 to 60% of us are going to have it at some point in their life, even if we don't go full blown and become hospitalized because of PTSD. Like I said, somebody who has a first responder, police officers, I know a man right now who worked as paramedic for 30 something years and retired. And he's not addressing, we gave him the opportunity to have counseling for his, he basically had a mental breakdown, and he won't face or address the trauma that came from that job as a paramedic. But I don't think he'll be getting out of the hospital anytime soon until he does. And that frustrates me. So if it was more normalized, not more acceptable to have, well, maybe more acceptable to have it. If we realize it's part of who we are and address it on a more normal basis instead of it being some kind of a stigma, is what I would like to see.
Got you. How about you, Chris? Is there anything that you wish more people knew about PTSD? Maybe the main thing you'd want watchers to take away from this discussion? Oh, sorry, Chris, your mic is muted.
How's that?
Better.
Sorry about that. I think a takeaway would be just to realize, because you have PTSD, that does not mean that you need to be shunned or treated any differently than anyone else with another illness, with depression, anxiety, or anything like that. We don't categorize or segregate anyone with any of these other illnesses, make them stand apart from another. So why should we if they have PTSD?
Right. Thank you. Well, we haven't had any audience questions. My final question for tonight, kind of a two-parter. The first part is, what kinds of challenges do people living with PTSD face? You already mentioned when we were talking about stigma, Chris, you mentioned discrimination in employment or maybe in other areas of life. Are there maybe Is
I'm
that kind of the main, aside from living with the post-traumatic stress itself, would you say that's kind of the main external obstacle that people face?
I think that would be partially true, yes. Another one would be, just what is it that's going to serve as a trigger? Always being that hyper vigilant, being cautious of anything and everything that you do. You're, you have reservations about going to a movie. You have reservations about where you're seated in a restaurant, and just checking your constant wound up, wound tight,
Mhm.
checking your surroundings. And then that not only goes in the public sector while you're at work or just out with the rest of society, but also within the family unit. Dad, don't sneak up on mom, because a lot of times, again, it's a silent. Um, and I hope I'm not violating anything here. A good example of that would be, watch the episode called God Bless You, Hawkeye. It's episode, God Bless You. And in that, there he is, much older than that little 9 to 12-year-old boy, and he's in war in Korea, the setting says, and he's taken down by the smell of wet burlap. That's all I'm going to say about that. And it resonates so true, because your olfactory can be a very powerful trigger of a memory.
Well, the second part of this question is there anything that individuals or organizations can do to help to remove those obstacles? Sounds like maybe a difficult one, given that a lot of different things could serve as a trigger depending on the individual and what the traumatic event was.
I have no ideas on that.
I think being aware, if a person hires a veteran, trying to have a understanding of more. I'm fortunate enough, I work for Department of Mental Health currently, and that work environment is so much more understanding of the mind-body connection, and uh, they have and I guess where I'm going with this is, some of these examples of what they do would be better for those other, like Chris said, the private employers and other employers, because it's not limited to veterans, the trauma response and the effects. So PTSD is not limited to those people. But I work for Department of Mental Health, and they have a day where if things are really bad, you can, like once a month, you have an hour where you can take that time and just go to leave work and de-stress or whatever it is that you need. It's a mental health time. Uh, they have peer people that you can go and talk to about whatever the situation is that might be too much. There's other things that they do, but I think if we could set that standard, I don't think it's the best standard by far, but it's the best in the 3 positions that I've worked with the state of Missouri and with private employers, that kind of understanding that trauma isn't, and the PTSD isn't something out there. It's not something contagious. It's
Right.
not a horrible illness. It's actually back to life.
And I think
And
maybe something that,
normalize.
sorry, I think I cut you off, Kelly.
I said to more normalize it and normalize self-care, mental health and self-care.
I don't want to detract from the experiences of people who have suffered from violence or abuse, but something that is really noteworthy to me. You mentioned, if you're an employer, if you're hiring a combat veteran, that maybe want to be more aware of these kinds of things. But even, based on the statistics you cited earlier, that this is something that a majority of us are dealing with on some level. And so I think awareness of that could go a long way towards, like you say, towards normalizing it, and also towards maybe just some level of empathy, and that this isn't some kind of special like consideration that's given to, to these people, that this is kind of a a basic level of compassion that we can all have for each other. Yeah.
Yes.
Were there any other obstacles or challenges that you wanted to mention, Kelly?
Well, I was just thinking, I do, because I'm a licensed counselor, when I'm at work with patients that are, it's called a forensic population. So all of them have committed some kind of crime that, because of their illness, that brought them into the hospital. And I do that 8, 9, 10 question trauma screening with all of them. And when I compare their records with what they say, when they're being honest, out of the possible 9 or 10 categories of trauma, most of them have 6 to 8.
Wow.
And so if you have a perfect life, which nobody does, and you have mom and dad there, you have that stereotype of the American family and the American dream, you can still have something go wrong. But most of us don't grow up in that environment. So just like I said, I guess it was back down to having more increased empathy with all of the employers and how we take care of ourselves and each other.
Right.
Not trying to preach, sorry.
No, that's great. That's great. I mean, part of why we do these is to give people with different perspectives kind of a platform to get their message out. So thank you for that. Chris, do you have any closing words before we wrap up?
I do not.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for coming on this evening. This is something that we've been wanting to do a program on for a while, so I really appreciate your participation. And thanks to everybody who's tuned in, who will tune in on YouTube. I need to mention that we do 2 or 3 of these online programs per week. The next one is going to be June 24th, 6:30 p.m. It's called Stories of Home, From Communist Hungary to St. Louis. Dr. Sabo is going to share his experiences with living in and looking back at Soviet-occupied Hungary, as well as finding Hungarian community in St. Louis. Again, that's June 24th at 6:30 p.m. if you're interested in tuning into that one. And with that, I guess I'll say good evening. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you on the next one.
All right, thank you very much.